What's up, welcome back to Nowstalgia. Dave here with a review of Formula One Drive to Survive Season 6, out now in full on Netflix. Of course, Drive to Survive is back to kick off the Formula One season as it has been for the last 5 years. This Season 6, of course, is covering the 2023 Formula One season, and I'm going to go through each and every episode, talked about what I liked the most, what I liked less, things I think the show missed overall. And yeah, let's get into it. I am a big Formula One fan. I watch every race, every qualifying session. I follow the sport very closely. So please leave a comment. Let me know what you thought. Hit me up on Twitter during the season if you're a big fan as well. But yeah, let's talk about this because, Drive to Survive, the hype, the impact it's had on the sport is well documented at this point. So we'll just kind of get into the season itself. And episode 1, unsurprisingly, I think smartly, talks about the Aston Martin breakthrough over the winter, where Aston showed up as the second, sometimes third, fastest team for the first part of the season. This was a great call to kind of highlight this development for its unexpectedness and Aston, the master stroke, basically, of signing Fernando Alonso. I wish they would have kind of hammered home that Alonso actually made a correct career decision for the first time in over a decade. Over the course of his career, he's had so much bad luck with his decision making. Some of that, of course, due to his own making and his personality, but I wish they would have hammered that point home. But nonetheless, it's nice I think Lawrence Stroll is a great presence for this show. He's a great talking head because he's got a big personality, right? He has big ambitions. So I like the focus on Aston. And of course, this episode kind of builds up to Alonso getting that podium at Bahrain for race 1. Of course, we get into Lance Stroll and his biking accident right before Bahrain and his actual very strong performance in that first race. We hadn't seen much of Lance Stroll over the course of recent seasons. There hasn't been a whole lot to really show, to be honest, but that was obviously the number one narrative to show for him. Of course, we also hint at some other stuff, Fred Vasseur, his first year at Ferrari, Claire Williams back as a pundit, which I thought was great. The Mercedes car still different, and the ominousness of that. We see Valtteri Bottas and his mullet, which is actually the only time we spend any time on Alfa Romeo. We don't hear from Zhou at all. Tough break for them. There's always one team that doesn't really get much on the season, and this year it was definitely Alfa Romeo. I also enjoyed watching Max Verstappen be bad at pickleball. It's nice to see some fault from him because we don't really see it on track. Also, we got our first introduction on Drive to Survive with Danica Patrick as a talking head on the series. Of course, she's on the Sky broadcast during the season, so not a complete shock to me. But that has been a big talking point with this series because she is a polarizing figure, let's say, primarily for her persona outside of motorsport. But also she's been, I think, kind of coldly received in the F1 world, of course, despite being a former racer herself. So, I didn't mind having a new head, like new personality there. I don't know if she really added a whole lot to the punditry. Like, obviously, someone like Claire Williams, due to her experience as a former team boss, a team at the bottom that had to face a lot of unique challenges, her perspective is a lot more valuable, and I think she was a better talking head. Without question, I'm happy she's there. So I'll be curious if Danica returns for Season 7, let's say. I'm going to come back to Aston Martin at the end here when I talk about what the show didn't do well. But ultimately, this was like the main touching point or main focus on Aston was episode 1. And unfortunately, this Season 6 only told half the story with Aston. And the part they didn't really tell, and I'll get to this later, the part they didn't really tell was a big part of the F1 season that they just kind of ignored. And it's hard to make this show. It's hard to tell a 10-episode kind of recap series. Like, there's so much to tell. It's so much to show. For example, they don't really talk about the sprint races at all. Honestly, probably for the best. The average person watching this show would probably just be confused by that. And obviously, the hardcore F1 fans, we don't like the sprint races anyway. So, whatever, right? But yeah, I think they did it was a great job to start with Aston, but I wish they followed up on this later. So we'll get back to that. Episode 2, I think this was also a pretty strong episode where we have Ricciardo returning to Red Bull with his tail between his legs as their third driver. Peter Baer introduced to us as the CEO of AlphaTauri with Franz Tost retiring. in Alpha, of course, pairing Yuki with Nick DeVries. Pierre Gasly off to Alpine, Nick DeVries in, 28 years old, Formula E, Formula 2 champion, had been in the Mercedes reserve for some time. Of course, being picked following his kind of miracle substitute run at Monza with Williams the previous year. I liked that they did the one episode on DeVries, but then also resolved the fact that he was fired mid-season and Danny Rick came back to race for Alpha. I like that they kind of just wrapped all that up in the one episode versus dragging that out. That was the right call. In general, reflecting back on season 5, they didn't tell the full story with what was going on with Red Bull in terms of filling the seat, in terms of how Gasly went to Alpine after Alpine lost Piastri to McLaren. This was never the first choice for Red Bull. They wanted Colton Herta out of IndyCar, but he didn't have a super license. They couldn't get an exception to that. They never told that story, and it was probably too complicated to tell that part of it. But it would have been interesting if Nick DeVries had been presented as someone who didn't have the full support of Red Bull at the time. Of course, famously, Helmut Marko and Christian Horner didn't agree on the decision to use him. Nonetheless, just kind of packing Nick up out of there, I think was pretty cool. Although I laughed. There was that scene, it was a Monaco boat scene where Sergio Perez is talking to DeVries about, his challenges early starting the year as he's having a tough time. And they're sitting next to Adrian Newey on the boat. Of course, the god of aero who works for Red Bull. Honestly, I'd rather hear what Adrian Newey has to say about basically anything than, Perez talking to Nick DeVries. If you're right there with a camera in front of Newey, can we talk to him? But obviously that's not how the show works. I get it. Of course, they have the Ricardo Silverstone test, which was very hyped up. Showing, I guess it is cool. I guess it is cool to have the cameras there and actually show that. It's good use of this show. So yeah, overall, I like episode 1. I like episode 2. I also like episode 3, where you have McLaren having this absolutely horrible start. Zach Brown has been a huge part of the show thus far. And I think they smartly presenting the circumstances. Will Lando Norris leave? He's good enough to win, but he's not able to win right now in McLaren. What's going to happen? They showed the Perez Miami win this episode. They also show the Silverstone turnaround as McLaren starts to get their shit together. But this is another thing that they don't fully communicate in season 6. Much like they don't tell the second half of the Aston Martin story, they don't really tell the second half of the McLaren story, where basically in the second half of the year, McLaren was the second or third best team almost the entire time. They show the standings, they show that McLaren came up, but they don't really highlight just how great McLaren was by the end. Of course, they leave out that Piastri wins a sprint race, getting a race win of any kind before Lando did, by the way. And I think they probably leave that out because they don't know how to communicate sprint races to the audience on this show, whatever. But there was a lot left on the bone here. Episode 4, of course, we have Haas. Gunter Steiner has been a big star from the show. Not surprised to spend time with them, even though they're the last place team. Hulkenberg's return to the grid. I like that they showed the suck my balls comment from Magnussen. That was funny. We also get introduced to James Vowles, new team principal at Williams, coming over from Mercedes. Although we don't spend really any time on the series with Logan Sargent. I was a bit surprised by that, given he had tons of struggles. Last year, you could have showed that. Also, he's an American driver, which has its own expectations and hype and things like that. So I was a bit surprised to not see much of Sargent beyond him talking a little bit with Alex Albon. But I think it was cool to kind of juxtapose Steiner and Val's approach versus the old school versus new school approach. More iron fist versus data driven, etc. I think that was a smart call there. In the early going when they're talking about the Haas car maybe having some promise, of course, before the lack of development, dooms them to last place, they show that Hulkenberg got 7th place at Australia. But they completely leave out that was because of the massive crash that took out half the grid on that restart at the very end of the race. It was completely circumstantial. So it's a misleading presentation. It wasn't really based on merit, but that's just how the show's going to work. Episode 5, we have the first of 2 episodes about Alpine. And I think this is one of the decisions that'll probably be polarizing to people watching this series, is you would spend 2 episodes on Alpine who ultimately finished the season in 6th place, getting passed by Aston Martin and falling behind McLaren, despite McLaren having a horrible start to the season. And, looking at this episode, where you have Gasly joining the team to pair up with Ocon, I do like this episode on its own because I think it did a really good job of showing you the past history that Ocon and Gasly both have about, how serendipitous that two Frenchmen from Normandy, France, from the same region of France, are now on the same Formula One team, like one of the odds. And, I think Ocon and Gasly's lack of friendship after knowing each other for such a long time, they did a good job of highlighting that and showing some past footage. That was great. You have the Ocon getting the Monaco podium, Gasly kind of getting fucked over. That was done, I think, pretty well. And they do a lot of good foreshadowing with Bruno Firmin, who eventually, of course, replaces Otmar Safnauer in the second Alpine episode when Otmar gets fired as Alpine team principal. And, this happens, in episode 8, episode 7. But, I wish they did a better job of, I think, communicating the reality of the Alpine situation, where the editing with season 6 really kind of laid the blame at Otmar Safnauer's feet. Some of Will Buxton's comments, some of the framing of Otmar is perhaps not a firm enough leader. Then you have Bruno, politicking behind the scenes. But it's mentioned, but they need to hammer home how much of a shit show Alpine is from a management perspective. Renault management. If you're going to do 2 episodes about one of the most disappointing teams of 2023, tell it like it is. Just blaming Otmar, who's an accomplished team principal. Look at his Force India days. I thought that was just kind of an unfair and inaccurate way to present it. It was Laurent Rossi's a tough operator. He has high expectations. He calls his guys out in the media at a race weekend. That was fucked up and bad leadership. And everything else, in and around him is bad. You could have highlighted the fact that Alan Prost left this team a few years ago. There's just people in and out. And they don't really, tell you the full picture of, you could have connected it back to Cyril Abiteboul, who was on the show before and was obviously a big talking head in the early seasons. They could have, I think, wove a better picture of the shit show at Alpine and Renault, but they don't really do it. It was cool to spend time with Pierre going to Cannes, though. That's just great footage. I'll love to see footage like that. Episode 6, we get to the Mercedes episode at last, where Mercedes have fucked up again by committing to the same concept that did not lead them to victory except one time in 2022. And I think this episode is good for actually showing you something meaningful between Lewis and Toto, where I think one of the most famous quotes from the season, Lewis telling Toto that he could be in motorsport for an F1 for 20, 30 years, but Lewis can't. Really good foreshadowing for Lewis's, of course, move to Ferrari just last month. And they, of course, also show the rumors that happened last year regarding a Lewis move to Ferrari, which, of course, was poo-pooed at the time. I would have liked if they take it a step further with, telling us about James Allison returning to the team mid-year, Mike Elliott being reassigned, and then, of course, leaving, the F1 operation at the end of the season. I would have liked if they kind of showed that. You have acknowledgement from Buxton of Merck team to lose top talent. They told us about James Vowles leaving, for example, but you could have wove that together, I think, a little bit more. They leave out Lewis's one pole position at, I believe, Hungary, which was a great moment in the season, but I understand why it's left out because it's kind of just a one-time thing here. Also, we don't spend time with Lewis's hunt to potentially steal P2 off Sergio Perez, P2 in the championship. I'll get to that later in terms of how they handle Perez, but that was also, I think, kind of lacking there. But yeah, I think the Lewis quote's great. That's one of the moments of the season. Episode 7, as I mentioned, is the second Alpine episode where Otmar gets axed. We see Ocon and Ryan Reynolds in the beginning there. Bruno Firmin comes in. Gasly gets his podium, the second Alpine podium of the season. I would have loved if we saw in this episode, towards the other part of the season, where Gasly got really mad on the radio for being told to give his position back to Ocon. I would have loved to see that, just because the anger moments, they show people cursing on the radio and stuff on this season, but that was like a dramatic thing. Like, show that. But yeah, ultimately, like I said, I think this was like too negative and too like simply framed as being Otmar's fault. Episode 8, great episode, I think. This is the Ferrari episode. Fred Vasseur coming to Ferrari to do a great job of explaining why the Ferrari team principal job is such a pressure cooker and the hype that Tifosi put on the Ferrari team to succeed. And also plainly putting that Ferrari, the winningest and most historic team in F1, hasn't won a championship in 15 plus years. Great job. They talk about Sainz getting the Monza pole, and they spend a lot of time with the Monza race, where, of course, Max passes Sainz to win the race. They presented it as a lot more dramatic than it actually was. Like, no one in their right mind thought Sainz had a chance to hold on to the lead there to start the race. But following that up, of course, the Sainz victory in Singapore, they also fucked this up because Sainz won Singapore, and it's framed as this great victory for the team and Fred keeping the team together despite a tough start to the season. But you needed to hype up Sainz in this moment because this was the moment of Sainz's career where through his tactical brilliance, he slowed down to keep Lando in DRS range, to use Lando as a shield to prevent the charging George Russell and Lewis Hamilton from passing them for the win despite being on better tires. Like, it was one of the most riveting moments of the entire season, partially because Max didn't win, but like, you didn't show that, you know? Also, they show the frustration of Perez and Max, but they should have also kind of explicitly said that the only reason Sainz won this race, the only reason Red Bull did not win this one race this year, was because they fucked up the setup. It was completely their own fault that they didn't win the race. It wasn't because Ferrari was actually better than them. So, I mean, if we had a Mercedes angle to this, I would have loved the fact that Russell didn't get the pass, and of course they show the crash, but like, Lewis probably would have actually got that pass done, and they don't mention that. But yes, not talking about Sainz backing up Norris intentionally, or backing up to let Norris stay in DRS range to like gift Lando a P2 and also protect his own P1. Like, that was one of the moments of the season, and to not highlight that, because there's tons of drama there too, like to not highlight that and to kind of simplify it the way they do, I just think that this is not telling the full story. Episode 9, perhaps the best episode of this season. I think this is framed excellently. It's the AlphaTauri story. You have 3 drivers for 2 seats, because after Ricciardo breaks his wrist, or breaks his hand, Liam Lawson shows up, and Liam Lawson does great. He gets into Q3 qualifying at Singapore on debut. And I thought that was done really good. Also, having Albon in the car, like, explain how DTS is going to frame the Ricciardo comeback. I hope that was genuine, because that was hilarious, watching him like really nail it. Also, when Lawson doesn't get a 2024 AlphaTauri seat, he's returned back to his reserve role as Ricciardo and Yuki remain AlphaTauri for this upcoming year. You actually get like an honest reaction from Lawson, who just is like dumbfounded and fucked up and thinks it's fucked up and doesn't understand why he didn't get the seat. That was great. Like, again, genuine reaction from him. So that was awesome. And then episode 10, I think wisely kind of focusing primarily on Vegas, and then also showing Abu Dhabi at the end there, but showing the Sainz drain cover thing with Vegas, and then Vasseur's very angry reaction to that. But yeah, I think there's a few things that were just kind of ignored or unfortunately not touched on with this. I mentioned some of the stuff with Singapore with Sainz. I mentioned Piastri's sprint victory. But more than anything, McLaren's comeback. As I said, McLaren making a huge comeback and really doing great as being a regular podium finisher at the end of the season. They just leave that out. And then on the other side of that coin, the Aston Martin fall off is just like not acknowledged, right? Like, what the hell? Alonso had 7, 8 podiums? He was on fire to start the year, as was that team, and they make a development mistake and they fall behind. And by the end of the year, they're behind Mercedes and they're behind McLaren. Like, the fact that you didn't do an episode about McLaren getting up and Aston getting down when it was the opposite to start the year, like, that was an easy framing to me. I don't know why they didn't do that, but it was also a key part of the story. And then lastly, for the second time in 2 seasons in a row, they don't talk about the drama with Sergio Perez. Last year, of course, Checo wins Monaco, partially because he crashes during qualifying, which famously pissed off Max Verstappen, who got red flagged and had no chance to actually win pole himself, right? And then Max pays him that favor at Brazil, where he doesn't let Checo pass him despite being out of the podium spots. And it's this whole drama on the radio. It's, a rare moment of team turmoil at Red Bull, right? They don't talk about it, despite being very dramatic for this show. This year, they talk about, the 2025 Red Bull seat being available, and Ricciardo, Yuki, and Liam, they all want it, right? They talk about that part of it, but they don't talk about why they're talking about it, which is that Sergio Perez was fucking up all the time in 2023. Despite getting only two wins though, he almost lost P2 to Lewis, despite being in a dominant car. And him just making all those mistakes. They show the Mexico crash, but they don't hammer it home enough. And again, it's dramatic. So I just don't quite understand why you're leaving something like that out, because he's one of the main protagonists of the year, and he was so disappointing that everyone's completely writing him off. I mean, people are coming into this year thinking that Ricciardo could replace him mid-season if he continues to fuck up. Why would you not talk about that? So that's a little annoying. Also, I think just in general, F1's been so dramatic leading into 2024 that a lot of this almost feels like old news. Of course, Lewis moving to Ferrari is the chief reason for that. But nonetheless, I think season 7, assuming we do get it, would be great because you're going to get so much meat out of the Lewis-Ferrari bone, right? And I think there's a lot of drama there to show there. Maybe any awkwardness in Mercedes. You could do more than one episode on that, I think. It'd be really cool to see Zhou Guanyu race at the China Grand Prix after that race had not been on the calendar due to COVID for several years. I think that would be kind of a layup episode to do. That'd be awesome. Also, I think depending on what happens in Mercedes, we could get introduced to Kimi Antonelli already. It would be really cool for this series. And yeah, I think obviously what's going to happen to Carlos Sainz makes plenty of sense to talk about that. And the driver market, which we know is not yet kicked off, but Lewis has thrown the grenade to get it going. So plenty, I think, to see, even if plenty to show with season 7. They talk about Steiner, the title card to end the series, season 6, that Steiner did not return to Haas. There's plenty more to talk about that in the beginning of the season, I guess. We'll see what happens with the Christian Horner controversy investigation. I think the Netflix box-to-box films, Formula One, all those producers regarding Drive to Survive, they would be down bad if they lost Gunther Steiner and Christian Horner, 6 weeks apart, because those are two of their MVPs of the series. Nonetheless, a satisfying series. I think it's more fun when you're not a hardcore F1 fan, because a lot of it feels new, but it's still really fun as a travel show, much like the sport itself. And there's so much drama, so many great characters within the sport, that even though I follow the sport so closely, nothing really stands out to me as new. I still enjoy the series. And I think ultimately, the best episode of this series, season 6, was probably episode 9 about Ricciardo, Lawson, and Yuki. I also liked the first Alpine episode with Gasly and Ocon's past. I think the Ferrari episode was good. Of course, the Lewis quote to Toto, I think, is perhaps the quote of the season. So ultimately, another successful F1 Drive to Survive season on Netflix. But let me know, how did you feel about Drive to Survive season 6? Do you think it's an improvement, a step back, somewhere in between? That's where I would land. Let me know. And for more TV reviews, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.